In this lesson, we're going to talk about typography, which, if you're not familiar with, might be a little bit of a strange thing to think about. What typography is the layout and design of type or text, the actual text within whatever you're designing and how it looks. Now, if you're like me, when I first started with design, I would just pick a font that I thought looked cool, type something out, and be done with it. But typography and the whole idea of typography is taking that cool font or whatever you chose, but picking that font based on an actual educated decision on how it's going to work with your design, and then not only just choosing the right font, but also laying it out in a way that is just as important as the rest of your design elements. And that's really the way that you should think about it. Now, we're not going to go super deep into the whole of typography in this course, but we are going to take a look at the tools that we have available in Photoshop and Illustrator for dealing with typography and how to use them to make educated design decisions on how all of these type characteristics work together. So I have 3 different projects for 3 different clients here that have been worked on by a different designer, and they've handed them off to me to do the typography. So let me just show you what I have for all 3 clients. I have one for an energy drink called Gravity Blaster, and that's this one right here. And this one has been created in Photoshop. This is what I have so far. So a 3D render of this can with the liquid. This is the actual label that'll go on the can. But they need the typography, the text that's going to go into this board, laid out nicely and have actual design considerations applied to that typography. So I have to fill in the text that I'm assuming is going to live on this side of the screen since it's empty. So can over here and text over here, which it looks like right here under display copy, their little tagline for this ad is going to be no holding back, no forgiveness. So I've got to figure out how to translate that from just this single line of text in my PDF brief into something that looks nice and works with this design in this document. And then I also have to include this disclaimer, which will probably be smaller, less prominent, but something that needs to be on the ad somewhere else on this page. So that's my first client. The next client is the HIP network. So HIP, and this is a new TV network. I've got some branding information for them, but what I've been given so far for this particular ad is this Illustrator document, which has an image placeholder for something for a new show, which in the brand overview, I believe the name of the show is going to be called, yes, Silver Lake. So Silver Lake is a show that they want to highlight in this particular ad. It says they want to highlight our new series, Silver Lake, with the copy premieres Thursday at 6/5 Central. That's what the 6/5 Central. In the US, a lot of times TV networks advertise things in Eastern Time, which is offset an hour from Central Time. So it's broadcast on the East Coast at 6 o'clock, which would be 5 o'clock on the Central Time Zone. And then I believe Mountain Time Zone follows Pacific Coast or West Coast, which would be offset. So it would be 6 o'clock Pacific Time as well. So that's why they say 6 o'clock, because it applies to both East and West, but then 5 o'clock for Central Time, and everybody else just figures out what time zone they need to be in. But that's what that little information means. We don't have a logo yet for Silver Lake, so we'd like you to mock up something for that show. Also include the following schedule. So this is going to be a schedule of shows on this channel, accounting for Central Time Zone time. So that's what this whole 5 Central thing was. So we've got 7 p.m. Hipster Haven, 8 p.m. Millennial Makeover, 9 p.m. Bachelor Plaid, and 10 p.m. Beards and Bicycles. Sounds like an interesting channel. Okay, so that's all information that I'm going to have to accommodate for on this design. Again, I'm assuming it's going to go on this side because this over here is a placeholder frame of their new show, Silver Lake. So that will eventually be video, not just a still image. And this is just the logo for the channel. I'm assuming it doesn't need to be that big or even need to be there. The designer just left it there for me to incorporate into the design. So there's that. And then my last client here is for a company called Wineographer. They are a vineyard that's going to be putting together an ad. They don't really have a text logo. It's just this illustration of like 2 rabbits. So it's a little bit more elegant, I think. This is going to be kind of a high-class ad. And after our brand information, we've got some display copy. There's a lot more here than the other two ads, so that's probably going to be a little bit interesting. And then I have the section that says bottle label, and we've got all this information. So let's take a look at the PSD. And here we go. So yeah, this is like like two halves on this design that I'm going to have to be concerned with. Let's take a look at the layers. I've got a frame with some information, probably from the designer, that says size to text. So this is just an element that the designer created to house the text, and then it's up to me to fit it to whatever I feel like the text needs to feel well, like it's part of the design. Then I have this little ornament that says use if you can. It's this little flowery thingy, so I guess that's a design element I can use, kind of like a divider or something if I choose to. And then on the other half, we have this wine bottle with an empty label. So I'm assuming that's what this bottle label thing is. It says winographer, wine company, and then all the actual information for that specific bottle of wine. So I guess I need to fill out all that information on this wine bottle label. And I think this is a smart object. Yeah, it says wine bottle mock-up. So if I double click on that, it's going to take me into a different document. And this is all set up nicely. I have a label smart object. So there's the blank label, so I can put whatever I want on here and it will show up on the wine bottle. And it looks like even that is a smart object. So that brings me into Illustrator. So okay, cool. So I'll probably be laying out my text inside of Illustrator for this one just through the smart object, and then updating it all through this mock-up, and I'll end up in Photoshop. So I've got my work cut out for me. Three very different clients here that are all going to need different type treatments and probably lots of different styles of fonts. So let's get to it. The first thing I want to talk about is how different these clients really are. Obviously, Gravity Blaster Energy Drink is going to look a lot different with their advertisements than this winographer wine vineyard company. Obviously, these little ornaments and elegant frames don't really go along with a extreme energy drink, and neither of these go along with what is on this network channel. It looks like it's very hip and cool and young. So it's up to me to make decisions for the typography that fit these three distinct styles. Why don't we start with the Gravity Blaster Energy Drink? That one's fairly straightforward. Let's take a look at that guide again. So I've got Gravity Blaster, some colors. I don't know that I'm really going to be needing much of the colors just because most of the design is already there. I'm just going to put on some simple text up there. But the display copy is just no holding back, no forgiveness. So why don't we just start there? I'm going to get that text into Photoshop. So I'm going to copy this here and just type out this text on a layer. So this is obviously way too big. Let's make it smaller. Now, this is just the default font that Photoshop used. It's obviously not what I want to use here. I'm going to have to pick a font that I think fits this brand. Now, I was not given any specific fonts to use, so I think that means that I do not need to use the same font that was used in the logo. I don't have to use any of the fonts that were used in the actual label. It's giving me a little bit of creative freedom there. But I still want to pick a font that aligns with their brand. It doesn't have to match their brand exactly, but it should go along with it. Again, if we go back to this winographer board and you see these little elegant elements, you're probably not going to want something that's big and crazy and bold like what's on this Gravity Blaster label. And whatever I end up putting on this wine bottle is probably not at all going to be appropriate for no holding back, no forgiveness. That sounds big and tough. It would go along with the wine label, not with this energy drink and this text. So the first thing that I want to do is think about what is an appropriate typeface that's going to fit this design and this brand. So before I go any further, I first want to just jump over to Typekit. So let's go there. Now I know we've already talked about Typekit, but it is included with your Adobe Creative Cloud subscription, and it gives you access to thousands of fonts that you can use at no extra cost in any project. But not only that, the actual website, this tool, is a wonderful way for being able to find very specific types of fonts. And it helps you narrow down your search to finding the right types of fonts that you want to use for any given design. And it's also just a really great way to kind of learn about typography and different type classifications. So if we take a look right here, this classification menu, this is a way to narrow down the type of font that we're looking at. And actually, before I even go any further, I need to clarify something. There are two terms in typography that are kind of interchangeable at this point, even though they have different meanings. Typeface and font. Typeface is technically the correct term when you're referring to a designed set of characters, and font is a specific version and size and styling of that typeface. So a popular font, let's say Helvetica. Helvetica is a typeface, and Helvetica Bold at 12 points is a specific font of that typeface. But like I said, those two words are pretty interchangeable at this point, and I'm almost always calling them fonts. So unless you're really talking to a type nerd or a type designer, you're pretty much fine calling it a typeface or a font. It doesn't really matter. But there is a distinction, and there is a whole world of typography. It's fascinating. I actually really enjoy getting into the history, and I used to mess around with letterpress printing and lead type, and it's just a fascinating world to me. So it's definitely something that if you're interested in, you should research. It's a lot of fun to learn about how type is actually designed. But for the purposes of this course, I'm most likely going to be referring to any typeface as a font. So with that out of the way, let's look at these classifications. This is a great way to kind of categorize different styles of type design. So the first one is called sans serif. And sans serif literally means without serif. That's what sans means. So what is a serif? We look at the second category, serif, right here. Well, if I make this a little bit bigger, you can see that serif fonts have a lot more little elegant details to them. There's a little bit more to them, whereas sans serif fonts are much more geometric. So a serif in typography is literally this little part right here that you find on the tip of that L, or the foot of that L, or the A. Those are called serifs, and if you don't have any serifs, then you're not going to see those hanging off. You've got an L that's just a perfect rectangle, basically. So that is, those two categories are two of the biggest classifications of type design. Next to serif, though, we have slab serif. Slab serif is a style of serif font, but it's much more geometric and a lot of times much heavier looking. So instead of having these nice curved lines that are kind of simulating the way that a quill or brush tip from like a calligrapher, the way that they would be drawing that by hand would look, instead, the slab serif font is much more geometric and chunky, so it's not going to have all those super nice curves, at least not always. This is obviously something that's flexible and subjective based on the way that the designer decides to actually design the type. But it's enough of a stylistic difference that it is in its own classification. Then we have script fonts, which are pretty self-explanatory. It's something that's going to look like it's more done by hand, but it's still very clean. It's a lot more like calligraphy. Most of the time looks like cursive, and is radically different from a serif or a sans serif font. And those are the four, I'd say, main classifications of type, but on Typekit we have even 4 more categories here, so let's just go through them quickly. There's black letter, and this is a very old style type of typography, and you can instantly see how all of these typefaces are very similar. So that is the black letter classification. And then we have mono or mono-spaced typefaces, and these are typefaces where every single character has the exact same width, and that's why it's called mono-spaced. It's the same space between every character, even on characters like this eye here that would normally be very skinny. It has this really weird nose hanging off the end here, or this the foot at the bottom of this eye that's making it wider. Now, the width from this side of the foot to this side of the foot is not as wide as something like the T here, but you'll notice there are bigger gaps on either side of that eye to compensate for that extra space. One of the biggest uses of monospaced fonts is for code, and the name of this first font is called Source Code Pro. The reason why coders like monospaced fonts is because when you're coding something out, the number of characters and the way that you indent things needs to be very consistent in order to keep track of the way that you're coding. It makes things much easier to look at and organize when every single character has the exact same width. That being said, sometimes there are fonts that are just monospaced fonts. They still look like any other nicely designed font, and they're not strictly meant to be used as something for code. But in the world of coding, you're going to see monospaced fonts when that code is actually being written. Alright, then we have a category called hand. This is something that looks very hand done. A lot of times it has texture, like this one right here. These are meant to look like they were hand drawn and generally have lots of imperfections to simulate that organic hand done look. And then finally we have decorative, which this is kind of a category on Typekit and most font websites that's just like anything goes. It's not a hard and fast category. It's kind of the miscellaneous folder of typefaces. So you're going to find things in this category that are all over the place. Some that have a built-in 3D look, some that have crazy wood patterns to them. It's really all over the place, but that's just kind of like the catch-all category that doesn't fit into any other classification. So easily in Typekit you can go ahead and identify whichever classification you're specifically looking for. So if you know that you need a serif font, you click on serif and you're not going to see any other results. Or if you need a script font, then you can go to the script category and you know that's what you're going to be looking at. One important thing to take note of is that Typekit not only gives you fonts that you can use on your computer, but it also gives you access to web fonts that can be used in web design. In the world of motion design, that doesn't really matter to us, but it is important to realize because there's this little checkbox right here called Include Web-Only Families, and that's going to add fonts that are available for web use, but not for desktop use, and you do not want to see those results because you can't use them on your desktop through Adobe programs like Photoshop and Illustrator in your designs. So make sure that Include Web-Only Families is not checked. Alright, so let's move on. Now that we've kind of picked a classification, let's just move it back to sans serif. Let's say that's the type of font we're looking for. Then we can move on to the next step. This is kind of ordered in a logical way of thinking. First you pick your classification, then you move on down to what you're going to use this typeface for. And there's just two options, paragraphs and headings. And you can see the little preview that we've got 4 lines of text and it's smaller, or 2 lines of text and they're bigger and bolder. So that's literally how you can think about it. Are you looking for something that's going to contain a ton of text with paragraphs of text, whether that's on a website or in a book or a magazine or just a big block of text that needs to be legible at smaller sizes? Or are you looking for something that's going to be used for a big statement, a big headline, or a bold block of text that's just a couple of words but taking up a large space in the design? Now, I don't always limit myself to one or the other of these, and that's because just because Adobe thinks that a certain font is good for paragraphs and not necessarily for headings doesn't mean that I won't as the designer. So that will help you narrow things down, but sometimes I just leave it off. Then we move down to properties, and this is where we can get very specific with the type of font that we're looking for. So just for fun, let's say I am looking for a heading font, just something that's going to work for big and bold text. Next we can look at the weight of the font. Because of all these previews, it's very easy to understand what this is going to narrow down. There's the weight of the font, which is if it's a super skinny font or a really big fat bold font or just a regular font. So let's say I want a really big bold font. Then we have the width of the font. There are basically 3 different types of widths that you can think of. There's the regular width, so that's just your standard. There's no really classification name tagged onto the regular width. But then you can get an extended or a wide font or a condensed font. And a lot of times you'll find font families that have all of these. So you'll have a regular version, you'll have a wide version, and you'll have a condensed version. And these are really great typefaces to know about because it gives you a lot of diversity within a single font family that was all designed together, so you know that they're going to work well together. Then there are a lot more little details in here that you have options to narrow down your search results, but these are very specific typographic properties that most of the time I'm not even bothering with. Just getting to the point of saying I need a sans serif font that's for a heading that's bold and condensed is enough to narrow down my search that I can see just 2 pages. So there are 25 fonts now for me to look through instead of thousands. One other thing to be aware of that you can't actually specify in this search result is that there is sometimes a font called an all caps font, like this one right here. You'll notice there are no lowercase letters like there are in the others. That means no matter what you type, it's always going to be uppercase. And if that's an issue, if you need lowercase characters, then obviously that one's not going to work. So be aware there are fonts that only have uppercase letters like that. Another great feature of Typekit is that you're able to switch through a bunch of different sample texts. A lot of the times they're using every letter in the alphabet, so you can get a quick overview of every part of that typeface. But you can also enter your own text, so I can type something out and get an immediate preview of what that's going to look like. So if I needed to get a quick preview of what this text might look like for my specific project, this way I don't have to download or sync the font and then type it out in Photoshop before I know whether or not it might work. Something else to take note of is this number right here under the fonts column. This is telling you how many versions of that font are contained within that font. So this first one has 56, the second one has 90. That's crazy. Let's take a look at that and see what's actually included. So this is an Adobe original, so this was clearly designed by professionals, so that's why there's 90 fonts in this family. Now you're not always going to have access to every single version, but because this is an Adobe font, it looks like pretty much every single version is included. But you can just see, as I scroll through this, it is a completely massive typeface that has so many different weights, widths, and styles. So be aware of that as you're looking through the lists of fonts, because sometimes you might find a font that you really like, but you know what, there's only one version of it, and you're going to need something that has uppercase and lowercase, or a bold and a thin version. And if there's only one version of that font, then you're not going to get what you need out of it. So be aware of that as you're looking through the fonts. And another feature of Adobe Typekit that's great is that the people running it are curating font packs all the time. And if for nothing else, you can use this as a way to just see how different types of fonts are being used together. So if I went to this logo-worthy letters font pack, it'll show me a bunch of fonts in some sample designs and just lay them all out for me, easily accessible, and I can just quickly pick and choose based on these curated lists. So that's a basic overview of Adobe Typekit and how it's useful in my own workflow on a regular basis. Now that we've gotten a brief overview of the world of typography and all these different properties of type, I need to pick a font that's going to work well with this. So first of all, I don't like the way that this text is just all on one line, and I don't even like this hyphen. And even though that was something that was directly in that brand guide, I think that I can take the liberty of removing that hyphen and then dropping this down onto 2 lines. And I know that I want to use a sans serif font because that's all that I'm seeing over here. I think that a big, bold sans serif font would fit this brand anyway. So I want to take a look at my Photoshop fonts, and I want to make sure that I'm looking at just my Typekit fonts. So that's this button right here. That will filter out everything but my Typekit fonts. And then I can also narrow down the category, the classification, just like we did on Typekit. So I want a sans serif font. So that's going to show me just my sans serif Typekit fonts, which there are a lot of them. And then if we take a look at this little arrow right here on some of these, this is indicating that there are multiple versions of that font or typeface within that typeface. So this first one, it has lots and lots of options. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 versions of this font, giving all different weights, as well as the italic version for every single one of those. So that's a very versatile font. And then after this Pro Condensed, we have Extra Condensed, we have Semi Condensed, and we have Wide. And inside each one of those, we have all of those versions as well. So this is going to be a very, very versatile font, giving us lots of different weights as well as widths of very similarly designed type. It's all going to work very well together. Now personally, I don't feel like this particular font has that much character to it. It's very standard, very clean. I'd like to get something with a little bit more personality. So I could go through this whole list and just kind of take a look at all of them. You can see that most of these fonts do have lots of different options to them. But there's one font in particular that I use quite a bit because of how versatile it is, called Balboa. What I really like about this font is that they're all very bold. It's pretty much all bold fonts, but they have lots of different weights. We have a very condensed, we have a very wide, and I think this particular typeface is going to work very well for this set of text. So let's just start with the extra black and take a look at the design so far. So obviously it's just white text. I think I'm going to match the white of this can design. So I'm just going to grab my eyedropper, click on that, and then fill with Option Delete, making sure that text layer was selected. That's going to change the actual fill color. Now I've got to decide where this should live in the frame. And I could just do this by eye. There's nothing wrong with that, but I'm going to do a little trick that's going to help me place this text a little bit by coming up to View and saying New Guide Layout. This is going to let me create some guides that are evenly spaced out across my canvas. So I want to have 3 columns and 3 rows, and make sure that this is set for my canvas. So it's making canvas guides, not guides that are specific to this artboard. Now that that's done, I'm going to click OK. And what this is going to do is give me this grid that's based on the rule of thirds. And that's a design term. It's something that you can worry about later. But basically, these sections of the frame where the thirds are on the horizontal and vertical axes, that's kind of good places to line up things in your designs. It's just a design technique that's used all the time. You can see that the can was lined up perfectly pretty much on that specific third on the vertical axis. But I can then take this text and like move it somewhere around this third. So I want this section to be where I line up my text, somewhere in this area. But those guides are just going to kind of guide me into where I want to place my text. So something like that. I'm going to turn my guides off by pressing Command:, and then again take a look at what we've got so far. So I've got the text on there. I've kind of fulfilled the requirement, but I'm not really happy with the text as a design. So first of all, I think I want to take this second line off. So I pressed T on the keyboard to get to my text tool, and then triple clicked on that line to select the whole line. Then I'm going to cut it, Command X, and then backspace one more time to get rid of that second line, and then click this check mark to commit the changes. Then I'm just going to duplicate this text layer. I'll switch to my Move tool, V on the keyboard, hold down Option or Alt, click and drag while holding Shift so that it moves straight down. Then switch back to my text tool, T on the keyboard, and paste. And I'll click the check mark one more time to commit those changes. Something I want to point out is that both of these text layers are center justified. I know that because right up here this icon is telling me center justified. If I had that no forgiveness selected and I changed it to left justified, now the text is always going to stay on that left edge. It's always going to align there no matter what I type. Whereas if I center justify it and I type some more out, it's keeping the center point of that layer right where it needed to be to keep it all centered. So let me undo, get back to where we were. I want these text layers center justified, so I'm fine with the way that is. But then let's think about how we can make this text just look a little bit more interesting and a little bit more designed. The first thing that comes to mind is making this line the same width as the line above it, so it's a nice block of text. So I'm going to just scale that up. That'll be the first thing I do. Scale that up so that it fits about the same size, and that looks, I think, a little bit better. That feels like a nice block of text that goes together. It has an intentional design decision of making the two lines of text the same width, even though they weren't the same as they were typed out in the same size. But all of that text isn't taking up quite as much space as I'd like to in the rest of this design. Other than the disclaimer text that will not be prominent at all in this design, this is it. This is all that my design is made up of, is this little phrase, no holding back, no forgiveness. So I want to make sure it's big and bold and that you really see it and that it feels like a solid part of this design. So what I want to try is changing the version of this font. So I'm just going to start at the top. I've got condensed, and obviously I can make that the same width, but I'm just going to use the down arrow while clicking on this and just go through the different weights. So we've got condensed, we've got extra condensed, we've got extra black, which we're already on, black, bold, extra bold, light, and medium, and ultralight. So there's lots of different versions. I think I want to keep something in the bold family, something that's still nice and big, but use one of these more condensed versions so that I can make it bigger. And that way the width will fill out to be the same width as the top line, but it's going to be a lot longer or a lot taller than the top line. So why don't we just try, we'll start with condensed and see what that looks like. So I'm going to scale that up to be about the same width again. I'm just doing this by eye. and then I'll drop it down, and that looks pretty good. I think that's interesting. It's got a little bit of variation in the two different styles of that font there, but it still feels like it's part of the same design because it was part of the same typeface family. But I want to see what happens if I change this to the extra condensed version and make it even bigger. Now that's nice and big. And the no on each one of these lines is almost the exact same width. That's a completely unintentional result, but I really like that, and I think I'm going to go with that. Because not only do the two no's line up so perfectly, but it gives it a lot more height, and I think that fills out the space a little bit better, and I like the way that that text is sitting now. Now I might play with the actual positioning of it, so let me grab these two text layers and drag them into the typography folder, and then just move that folder around a little bit. So let me bring up my guides one more time, Command:, and then I'm just going to shift this over a little bit. It looks, you know, if I were to line the center of this up with the center of this third and drop it down to the center of the frame, then I think it feels a little bit cramped in with that can. If I zoom out here, it feels like it's just crammed in there. But I can balance the design out a little bit if I just move this over somewhere around this area, I think. That's kind of going to balance out this liquid that's coming out on the left side, and raising it up just a little bit is compensating for the splashes that are coming out down here. Then I'll bring my guides up one more time, and then maybe I'll just shift it up so the top of the text lines up with that particular third guide right about there. And just like that, I was able to use my guides to kind of aid me in where this placement might work while still paying attention to the other design elements. I'm not just looking at the guides. I'm looking at what else is in my document before I decide on what that text should look like. But I think that's actually going to work really well. I think those two elements work well together. We've got the big giant can with the cool splashes. We've got the text, no holding back, no forgiveness. Now all that's left is the disclaimer text. So let me go grab that from the PDF. Just going to copy that as a whole, and then I want to put that down at the bottom. A lot of times you just see them, you know, that fine print text that's like gray and very hard to read at the bottom of any kind of commercial. That's what this disclaimer is going to be. So inside the typography folder, I'm going to type this out, or paste it in rather. Click the check mark, and then I'm going to have to scale it down quite a bit. So let's just drop it down to like 24. And I don't want to use the same font. I probably need to make something that's a little bit more readable, something that's not all caps. And that's actually something I forgot to point out. This text is all caps, but the font itself is not an all caps font. And that was just kind of a happy coincidence. The last time that I used the character palette, I had all caps enabled, so it automatically changed it to all caps. But if I turn that off, you can see that that just does not work, not nearly as well as having a full solid block of text like this. Since it's a sans serif font, it's big and bold, it's very geometric, and it lends itself to being in this nice rectangular block of text. So much better than if it were you know, proper case like this. So, sorry I forgot to mention that, but that was a deliberate design decision, and you can see why. For this this text down here, I think I can actually use this same font, but I might want to not use the extra condensed version, maybe just the slightly condensed or the regular condensed version, because at this size, extra condensed is really hard to read. And this is a disclaimer, so you need to be able to read it. And I also think I want to take the all caps off because that does make it a little less legible at this size. If I take it off just like that, we can see it just feels a little bit more like regular text that you're supposed to read. So I've got that down where it needs to be. I just want to align it to the center of my artboard. And then I need to probably break this up into two lines. So let's see right about where the halfway point is. This little marker right here, when you're editing a text layer, is the halfway point. So I'm thinking probably right before drink responsibly. That's where I'll drop it down and commit that change. And this brings up another typographic tool and method that you need to be aware of called leading. And another term for that is line spacing. So if we have this layer selected, and we take a look at our properties, right here is our leading. It's set to a custom number of 132.57. If I change this to auto, then it's going to base the line spacing on the actual font size. So as I change the font size, that spacing is going to change. But if I were to say put in, you know, 36, and my font size was 18, it's going to be 36 regardless of whether it's 18 or it's 36 or it's 72. That line height is never going to change. So auto is generally a good rule of thumb for when you're doing multiple lines of text, but if you need to be very specific about how much line spacing is going between fonts, then you can very easily adjust that just by plugging in a custom number here. Now I do want this text to be center justified, so I'm going to leave it like that. Drop it down a little bit, I don't know, somewhere around there. Probably looks pretty good, but it's taking my attention away from what I need to be seeing. It's too noticeable right now. So I think what I want to do is just drop down the opacity a little bit. So I'm going to grab this and drop it down to around, I don't know, 50, maybe 40 even. That way it's there, it's visible, you can read it if you look at it, but it's not that distracting from the rest of the design. Alright, one last thing I want to do to this design is just add a little bit of texture to this text up here, just to give it a little bit of grittiness, a little bit of grunge, so that it kind of goes along with the rest of the brand. So I'm just going to quickly make a new empty layer above the typography folder, right there. I'll call this texture. I want to make that a clipping mask of the group, so I'm going to hold down Option or Alt, click right between those two layers, and now whatever I paint in on that layer is only going to show up on top of the layers within that group. Okay, so I need to pick out a brush that has some texture to it. I'm thinking that I'll probably look at, actually probably the effects box, that's where it already was, and then just find something that's kind of like, I don't know, splattery, or like this one right here that just has a bunch of texture to it. So we've got, looks like it's called Aqua Tint, and then I'll just brush a darker version of that same color on it. So probably something like that. Doesn't have to be too dark. So actually, you know what? I'm going to get rid of that layer. A better way of doing this is just making a solid color and choosing the color that I want it to be, so a little bit darker probably, and then making that a clip group, a clipping mask of the group, and then inverting this mask. So it's not applied to anything right now. It's not doing anything to the group, but as I brush onto this mask with white, then it's going to apply that color. And that way I can just change the color to whatever I want it to be after the fact very quickly and easily. So if I just paint a little bit, you can see what that text looks like, or that texture. I'm not really happy with that. I think I need to turn my flow down. So let me grab that flow, turn it way down, and then try again. There we go. Now that's applying a lot less texture, but I'm just going to give it a little bit of grunge around the outside edge. And this does not need to be very apparent, just a little bit of subtle texture here. Maybe take some out on the top here. But you can see that's just this nice, crispy, grungy little texture. I think that's actually going to work. Maybe make the color a little bit less saturated. Now that I can do this, now that it's a solid color, I can do this very easily. But I'll just make it a little less saturated, maybe a little bit darker. Right about there looks good. And just to blend it all into the scene a little bit, I'm going to add a curves adjustment also as a clipping mask of that group and just darken it a little bit. Does not need to be a ton. And then do a radial mask. So let me get the gradient tool, make sure it's set to radial, and then add a gradient probably from around here fading over there. So this is what my gradient looks like, and that's being applied over top of the text. If I turn that off and back on, it's kind of just making the right side darker and the left side brighter. So there we go. I think that little bit just helps blend it all into that design a little bit better. And I think I'm going to call this design good. I'm happy with the typography. I'm happy with the way that everything fits well together with what was already there. And I'm going to move on to the next design. So for this one, I'm going to jump over to Illustrator. I'm going to work on this hip network kind of schedule promo package frame that I have to design. So let's take a look at what actually is going on here. I'm going to get rid of this. Take a look at the hip network. Here we go. So the deliverables are, we've got a design board for channel schedule promo. We need to highlight the premiere episode of Silver Lake, and they do not have a logo yet. So that's probably the first thing I want to work on. Since they don't have a logo, I don't, obviously I don't know a ton about the show, but from what I can tell in this network, it's going to be very hipstery. So I think that's enough to go off of. I really doubt that this is going to be the final logo that they use, but they just want something as a placeholder in this design. So I'm just going to scale this logo down and just move it off to the side for now. It's going to be incorporated somehow, but I want to focus on this Silver Lake title. So obviously I need to first type out the text. So Silver Lake, one word, scale that up, and I'll make it the same gray color as this one right here. Again, from what I can tell on this branding, it's very clean, it's very geometric, it has a sans serif font for the logo of the actual network, but I don't think I want to use a sans serif font for this particular show title. I think I want to make it look a little bit more hipster, for lack of a better word. So what I'm going to look for is something that has a lot of personality, like even more so than what we just dealt with, something that has serifs probably. Let me move this out of the way so as I scroll through these we can actually see it update. But I want to limit this to Typekit fonts. And then, I don't know, let's just look at slab serif and see what we have. Now, I don't have that many, but let's make sure this text is selected. Here we go. Come on, Illustrator. Slab serif, here we go. So I've got these options here. So I kind of like that Clarendon Text Pro. That's a cool font. Has a bold version, bold italic. Okay, so that's an option. That one's a little too, I don't know, playful. But something I want to point out is that as I'm looking through these, I'm literally getting a vibe or a mood from them. I can tell that like this particular font right here, it just feels, I don't know, it feels wrong, is really all I can say. It doesn't feel like what I would imagine going on this channel. This one fits a little bit better, but it's still not quite what I have in mind. It just doesn't feel quite right. So I'm gonna go ahead and take off slab serif and maybe just look at serifs in general. And oh yeah, actually that first one is much more along the lines of what I was thinking of. It only has a regular and italic, but I'm not doing a ton of text. It's just one word, so that might be all that I need. But let's take a look at some other versions, some other fonts. That one's a lot of fun. Actually, we've seen that one before, Gastromon. That was the School of Potion logo. This one actually up here I have used before, called Bookmania. Yeah, okay, this one has a lot of versions. And I just really like the serifs on it. I think it's just a very big, bold, identifiable font. So why don't we start with that one and maybe even just go all the way down to black. Let's start with that and see what we can come up with. Okay, so what I want to talk about right now is some more typography tools that we have access to. So I'm going to come up to Window, down to Type, and to Character. The shortcut for that is Command T. But that's going to give me the character palette. And I'll expand this out so that I have all of my controls. We've already covered things like the size of the font. You know, obviously you can just scale the text layer up and down, but if you need to put in a very specific weight, like 119, you can do it that way. We've talked about leading, which this is one word, so it doesn't really apply to this specific example because I don't have multiple lines of text. But next up is the kerning. And we've talked about this a little bit, but I'm definitely going to want to use it on this particular example because it's going to be a logo, or at least treated as one. It's not just a little word in a line of text that you're going to read and not really notice all these tiny little differences in the spacing of all the text. It's something that needs to feel solid and well designed and like it was actually meant to be spaced the way that it is. If we take a look right here, it says auto, and what that means is that Illustrator or Photoshop, whichever one you're using, is basically going to look at the type of font that it is and use the kerning style that it thinks is going to be best suited for that typeface. Now, under here we have optical and metrics, which says Roman only. Don't really worry about what that means. Optical and metrics, and then 0. Now, if I turn it down to 0, the spacing on my text changes. If I undo and redo, you can see that it is actually updating. 0 is basically saying don't do anything to kern this text. Just put the characters out there with the margins that they were designed with. The thing about type design, though, is that the person who actually created the font in the font making program is choosing what the spacing between two characters should be. And they're doing this by hand very, very intentionally. And to give you an example of why this is so important, I'm going to type out an A and a V. And this is why there's a V and an A on the kerning and on the tracking in your type tool, type panel, because This is a perfect example of two characters that need different spacing than a lot of other characters. If I had a capital, let's say D, that has a straight edge on the left side, and on the left side I put a capital I that also has a straight edge on each side, it needs a decent amount of space between those two characters, otherwise they feel very cramped in. Because I have this set to 0, the kerning is being thrown out the window. All of the kerning that the type designer programmed into this typeface is being disregarded. But if I set that to metrics instead of 0, my type updates, and Illustrator is now looking at the kerning that the type designer intended to be used when those two characters are next to each other. Going back to the A and the V, you can see that those two characters are actually overlapping. If they were perfectly aligned like the I and the D, it would look like a gigantic gap between them, even though there really isn't. This part of the A, the furthest part right, is right up against the furthest part left of the V. And spelling out avid was completely unintentional, but there you go. It's a good example. I can pretty much guarantee that you will never be setting this to 0. There's pretty much never a reason to disregard the kerning that has been coded into the typeface. So either leave it on metrics or on auto, or sometimes I'll use optical. What optical does is it's kind of Adobe's intelligence, like artificial intelligence, looking at the kerning that was plugged into the typeface, but then actually looking at the forms of every character and seeing how far apart they're spaced, and kind of compensating in the way that it thinks it needs to. So it's kind of like an auto kern. It's an optically kerning method that sometimes produces nice results, but also sometimes doesn't. So you can't rely on it 100% of the time. So for the most part, I just leave it at auto, and that gets the job done. If I notice any issues, then I'll adjust it. So let me get rid of this, and we'll go back to Silver Lake. So let's just take, I'm going to turn off my guides for a second, Command:, and just take a look at the word as a whole and see that there are some gaps in here that seem a little bit bigger than they need to be. When you're looking at a word, a single word like this, so large, you can tell that there's kind of more of a gap between the K and the E than there is the A and the K. And same thing for the S and the I than there is for the I and the L. So I can adjust the kerning a number of different ways. First way I could do it is press T to get to my text tool and click between the S and the I, and then adjust the kerning by going to the drop down and saying, I don't know, -25. That brought the I over. I could also hold down Option or Alt and use my left and right arrow keys to increment by 20 units on that kerning. Or I could click right here and, very, very precisely adjust the kerning. So that's one way to do it. Another way is using a completely different tool. If you hold down in the Type tool, there's one called the Touch Type tool. The keyboard shortcut is Shift-T for that. This is a fantastic tool for kerning because not only does it just allow you to click and drag on a character to move it around on the horizontal axis, you can actually move it up and down off of that baseline, which is that imaginary line that the letters are basically sitting on right down here. If I just click off of this and hover over it, actually, you can see right there, that little line right there, that's the baseline. So the baseline shift is basically offsetting how far from the baseline your letter is sitting. You could also even scale it up or down if you wanted to. So let me get back to where it was, and what I want to do is actually just select it and then just tap it with my left and right arrow keys. So that way I can very quickly just take a look and say, this E needs to move over a little bit. And there we go, now it's over a little. I'll bring that one in a little bit too, bring this one in, and just very quickly I'm able to jump around from character to character, looking at the text as a whole without having to, select between these two characters, use my keyboard shortcut. It's just a tool that's much more designed for this type of adjustment. Now I don't want to go crazy. I don't want to bring these in so tight that it feels claustrophobic and a little hard to read. I want to make sure that there's consistent gaps between all of the text and that it feels like it has a nice flow to it without feeling too cramped. So I think I just want to bring this L in a little bit and that A just a tad, and I think that might be pretty good. So that's one way to do your kerning. And just to show you the before and after, I'm going to duplicate this and set this back to auto. And now you can see how the gaps have changed just from that Touch Type tool kerning. And don't forget that there's also tracking. So tracking is like kerning, except it's spacing on the entire line of text. So it's going to universally increase the spacing between characters. So it's going to put a lot of space there from there you can go in and adjust kerning. So kerning is between two characters, tracking is an entire line of text. Or at least whatever characters you have selected. I could just take the word lake and take the tracking off of that completely, and then just the word silver is going to have it. But you cannot select multiple letters or multiple characters and then change the kerning to say 50. It's going to give you an error. Kerning is only for between two specific characters, not multiple characters at once. And there's one last really important thing about kerning fonts that we need to cover. So I made a new document really quick. I just want to type out this sample text. So we'll just say sample text in this font that I found on a website called Dafont, D-A-F-O-N-T. There's lots of websites online that have free fonts for download. There's Dafont, there's FontSpace, there's a whole bunch of them. The problem with them is that anyone can upload these fonts. The people designing the fonts are not necessarily paying that much attention to the way that they're designed. Because they're free, they're not trying to make any money off of them, they don't really have much incentive to, but you have to be aware of it if you're trying to find fonts on other websites other than Typekit. But also be aware that we're having to use Typekit in this course because you have access to so many great professionally made fonts at no extra cost to you. But that doesn't mean that that's the only place to find professional fonts. There are so many websites online that sell professionally designed fonts that are incredible. You just have to realize that there are people who are dedicated to creating and designing typefaces that are versatile and work and have 90 different versions, so they can be very expensive. And rightly so. It takes a lot of time and effort to design a typeface that works for multiple languages in all these different weights and in a way that you don't have to do a lot of work with kerning, which is why Adobe Typekit being included with Creative Cloud is such a big deal and why we use it all the time. But there are other websites just as big as Typekit and even bigger, like myfonts.com, fonts.com, Monotype. There are lots and lots of type foundries out there that are creating and selling professionally designed fonts. This font, for example, is a little bit more cartoony, so you know the designer probably had a little bit more lenience with how aligned everything was. But just taking a look at the kerning here, between the S and the A, those two characters are running into each other, and between the T and the E, there's a little more space than I would like. So this is kind of an extreme case where this font was just poorly kerned. But even with professional fonts, the kerning, while it might not be poor, is not always going to work the way that you need it to. And that's why it's so important to know how to adjust kerning manually. And another thing to be aware of is if you're using a script font, let me just switch to any script font that's installed on my machine. So this one right here is a good example. This needs to have auto kerning turned on, because if I were to turn on optical, that's going to shift things around. And if we look right here where this E and the X go together, the whole smart intelligence thing of Adobe trying to optically align the kerning is messing with the kerning that was very specifically programmed into this particular font. These characters need to line up exactly no matter how you type them out. So if you were to kern them, you know, or track them out with 100 tracking, then it's not going to display correctly. All of those letters are going to be disconnected. It's not going to look like one continuous brush stroke anymore. So it's important to realize what your tracking and kerning adjustments are going to do to the fonts that you're using, especially when it comes to things like script fonts where the characters need to line up correctly. Alright, I'm going to delete that duplicate, and now I'm going to talk a little bit more about some advanced typography. Certain type designers have included alternate versions of characters to give you a lot more versatility with things like designing logos. So specifically on this font, I have a lot of different versions of pretty much every character. And if I highlight it like this, I can see previews of my alternate versions of that character. So I've got a very interesting designed S right there that's totally different, but it still goes along with the design of this actual typeface. And I can pretty much highlight over any one of these characters, and there's at least one different version of every character. So I could go absolutely crazy and just make this a totally wacky looking logo. Obviously that's not what I want to do, and sometimes I'm going to run into issues like this where the R just ran into the L, and that's not going to work out at all. But it opens up a lot of possibilities when coming to just designing something with pure type and no other design elements. I can also click on this little arrow here, and that's going to open up the Glyphs palette, which is under Window, Type, Glyphs. But with my character selected, that's going to show me all the alternates for my current selection. Or I could just switch this to the entire font, and we can see everything at once. And you can see this font is just filled with alternates of basically every single character. So why don't I undo and get back to my standard text and move this out of the way so we can actually see it, and then we'll take a look at the alternates for specific characters. So let's just start with the S here. So I've got that. I'm going to say selection or alternates for current selection, and then make this a little bit bigger. We've got a smaller version of the S, a more decorative version of the S that still has this little serif at the top. We've got one that has more of a swash. We've got this super curvy, curly little S. We've got one that has serifs on both sides. So lots of options. I think this one right here is my favorite because it still preserves the little serif that's kind of uniform throughout the entire font, but it gives me this little decorative tail that I kind of like. So let's call that one good. And then just kind of look through what some of these other characters might benefit from having alternates. I don't think this eye is really going to benefit because this little swash tail coming off the eye is really going to mess with the spacing of everything. That would probably make more sense if it was at the end of a word. So I'll undo that. Maybe we'll go to the L. Now there are some different versions of this that are very interesting. We've got one with the tail that goes down below the V a little bit. We've got one that goes curls out a little bit more extremely, and then one that pushes everything out. So I don't think I want to use that one. Maybe just this simpler one would be interesting. Honestly, that might just be a little overboard. I think that tail underneath the L is just distracting from the rest of the word. So I think I just want to keep it this standard uppercase L or lowercase l, which, fun fact, the reason why they're called uppercase and lowercase is back when letterpress printing was the method of printing type. You had a case, a letterpress drawer that had a font in it that was uppercase letters only. And the reason it was called uppercase was because that specific drawer was in the case that was upper. It was the upper of the two cases, and then they had a lowercase where all the lowercase letters were. Fun little fact. Anyway, back to this. Let's take a look at this V. This has some interesting swatches coming off the right edge that kind of go over and above that E. This one isn't going to work because it pushes the text out, but I actually really like the way that V is kind of arching over the E. It just feels fun and unique. So maybe we'll keep that. Maybe I'll use this one. I'm not sure. That one also is nice. I'm really not sure. I like the arching of this one, but it might be a little bit too much. The V and the E kind of don't fit quite as well together as I'd like. So maybe we'll just stick with this one for now. Maybe don't do anything with this E. I definitely don't want to go crazy and overboard with this, so why don't we just move on to the R. We've already taken a look at some of these. I don't think any of these swashes are going to work because they just can't reach over the L, and the other ones are just going to push it out. So let's keep that the same and then take a look at the L maybe. Maybe we can find something for that. Actually, yeah, this might work better because we already looked at the alternates for this, and maybe that little swash underneath could work well on this L instead. And maybe we'll just keep it simple like that one. Yeah, I like that. Okay, next up, the A. I could try doing an alternate A like that, but honestly, I think I like the standard A better. The K, oh wow, K has lots and lots of versions. Some of them are really wacky. I kind of like this one right here. Is there one that maybe goes underneath the E? That one's crazy. Look at that. It kind of frames the E. I think that might be a little bit too extreme. Let's see if there's just one that just goes over the E. There we go. That one's a little bit better. I think that'll work because it just ties into the E there. Just kind of, it's almost hugging it there. It's bringing it in. But it's got the standard serifs down at the bottom. I like that. And then finally we've got this standard E at the end. I don't know. I really like this alternate version where it's just kind of got a different feel to it. It's got that same swash that we have at the beginning with the S. It kind of just is a nice balanced front and tail end of the logo. So I think I'm going to keep it like that. If we take a look at this as a whole, I think this is feeling a lot more like a logo instead of just typing out some text. So the next step is just making some sizing and kerning spacing adjustments. Obviously this is not fitting together the same because the characters are different. So let's get to our touch type tool. I think this A can be brought in above the L a little bit more. The E could come in just a bit. This L might be shifted over a tiny bit. The E and the V could be closer together. Same for the V and the L. That's feeling a much more tight and cohesive. I like the way that looks. But another little technique of just giving a little bit more personality to a typographic logo like this is maybe increasing the size of the first character a bit. So I'm going to grab this top right handle and just scale it up a little. I don't know, maybe around 125%, 128, something like that. And then maybe lift it up a little and bring this I over. Now I just did that by hand, so that actually lifted it up on the baseline. So I want to get to the baseline shift and set that back down to 0. I really should have just used my left and right arrow keys there. But this way, the widest point of this curve is lined up to the gap that's in that I there. I think that is fitting in there really nice. And just like that, we're able to transform something that looks like this into something that looks much more like a logo. I'm actually really happy with the way that turned out, and considering that this is just pretty much for a placeholder logo, I'm totally happy just calling it good and leaving it like that. So there we go. We've got my typographic logo for the show Silver Lake, and now I have to fill in the rest of the information from my document. So let's go over to that document and take a look at what we have. So we've got to highlight our new series, Silver Lake, with a copy, premieres Thursday at 6/5 Central. So let's copy that over. Premieres Thursday at 6/5 Central. I'm not going to want to use the same font that I used for that logo because this is going to be something that goes along with the branding of the actual channel, not the branding of this specific show. But I'll deal with that in a second. Let's get the rest of the information up. So we need the following schedule accounting for Central Time Zones. So I'm just going to copy this whole block of text and paste that in here. That is a lot of text, but I'll just break it up into a couple different lines. So there we go. We've got 4 other shows that we have to account for and put a schedule up for, and then format in a way that accounts for Central Time. So probably something that looks more like this, 6/5 Central instead of 7 o'clock p.m. Alright, and then I probably do want to use this logo, whether it goes in the bottom corner, somewhere around here, I don't know, we'll figure that out. But now it's just a matter of kind of placing stuff on the screen where it needs to be and choosing the right font. Let's think about what font we could use that goes along with the logo's branding font. So sans serif, bold, geometric. Let's take a look at those categories. So I'm going to grab all of my text and then go over to my character palette and say sans serif. And then just kind of scroll through these. Now I don't want anything that's hard to read. I don't want anything that necessarily has, you know, kind of these interesting design choices that don't really fit the brand of the channel. I think I just need something pretty simple. There's one font in particular called Proxima Nova that's very versatile. It has lots of different versions. We've got the standard version, we've got an extra condensed version, and the soft version, which is rounded ends instead of the geometric or rectangular ends. But I think I want to go with the Proxima Nova, Proxima, because it does have lots of different weights and it's just a very clean geometric bold font. So why don't we do something like this just as a start, and then think about how we're going to break up the different shows from the times. First of all, I need to account for that central time zone, so I think I want to format all of my times like this up here. So I'm going to change this from 7 p.m., 8 p.m., 9 p.m. to just being 7, 6 Central, 8, 7 Central, with a slash between them, so 7, 6 Central. And then I've got 8, 7 Central. Got 9, 8 Central. We've got 10, 9 Central. Okay, so I think that's a good way to lay out the times, but I don't like the way that the text is all just left justified with those dates, or those times, because it's a little bit harder to read the names of the shows when they're all laid out that way. Instead, I want to line up the show titles together and then maybe line up the times together separately. So I'm going to need to break this up a little bit more. So I'm just going to move it over here for a second, and I'm going to duplicate it down here just for reference. So I want to start with just the times. So I'm going to get rid of all the show titles. Okay, and then I'm going to duplicate it one more time, line it up, and then get rid of the times. And just that really helps. That aligns all of the show titles on the left edge. I can get rid of my reference, and then the times are a separate unit. So I can see these are two different types of information, times and shows. To make this line up even better, I think I'm going to take this text and then align it, the justification, to the right. That way the right edges are all exactly the same. So we see that central line, or a central character that's consistent through every one of these lines, all perfectly aligned in the same vertical space. And that just gives that entire text more structure that's easier to identify what is actually being presented to me. I'm going to turn my guides back on so I can see the center mark of this section. This is the center of this rectangle right here. And just kind of line that up by eye to the center of that guide. And now I want to just kind of play around with the different weights and styles of the text. So this premieres Thursday at 6/5 Central. That's kind of the main point of this frame, is advertising Silver Lake. It's big and bold at the top, highlighting it that it's a new series. So I think I want to make that stand out even more than it does already. So I think I want to change this from extra bold to just black. Make it the biggest, boldest version of this entire font. And then I'll align that to the center. So no matter what I do to it, it's always going to line up there. From the center, it's going to extend out on either side. And then I think I want to make it all caps as well, just so it's nice, big, bold, gets your attention, something like that. That's really big, so I think I might want to scale that down a little bit. Maybe I don't know, 54 points, something like that feels a little bit better. It's not competing so much with the title that way. And then I also want to point out that this is a new series. That's something that they said they want to highlight. So maybe I'll grab this text, duplicate it up here, and say new series. But maybe this one doesn't need to be quite as big and quite as bold. So I'll make it smaller, get my character palette back, Command T, and turn off all caps. And then why don't we even just change this to being a much lighter version of the font. So maybe not all the way down to thin, but light or even just regular will help make that just not quite as attention-grabbing. Maybe 24 points, something like that. And now we're building what's called a hierarchy, and that's a design principle. You're kind of organizing the important information and stylizing the text or the elements that you're dealing with in a way that brings your eye to the information you need to see. So we've got the text that says new series, which is kind of a secondary to the actual title of the show. The important thing is you see Silver Lake premieres Thursday 6/5 Central. That's the thing the client really wants to see. So we've got a big new logo. That's the first thing your eye goes to. Underneath it right away you see premieres Thursday 6/5 Central. And then you're immediately going down to the rest of the text. Now this text is still obviously being worked on, but I've already started to build in my hierarchy of information. The important stuff is up at the top, it's big and eye-catching, and then we move on to the secondary information that's also important, but it is secondary. Alright, now one thing I did notice is that when I made this all caps, my C became all caps, and I want to be consistent with the other central indicators down here in the rest of the schedule, so I'm going to select just that C, and I'm going to make it a small caps. This is a different version of caps. If I make the entire font small caps, you can see that it still has smaller characters, but it's keeping them all caps, so it's just a different stylistic choice. So I'm going to undo that and select just the C and make that small caps. So there we go. We've got the C that's smaller, consistent with the rest of the scheduling. Now I think I also want to break up this a little bit from the rest of the information just by adding a simple divider, just a little line, so that we can kind of see two different chunks of information. So I'm just going to grab my line tool and right about here draw a perfectly horizontal line and give it a stroke that's the same color as the text, and then increase the stroke to be a little bit thicker. So maybe, I don't know, 4 points, just like that. And it's just a simple vertical or horizontal line bar that just is going to break up the two different sections of information. I'll line that up to the guide so it's nice and centered. I want to make sure this is all being very consistent. Everything should be centered on that guide. There we go. That's all looking good. Maybe I'll make it a little bit wider here, and then just maybe 1 point thinner. Something like that. Okay, so there we go. Turn my guide off and we can kind of see that is just breaking up the two different sections of information. I want to incorporate this logo somewhere. I think down at the bottom here, since this is such a centered design, I'm going to keep it centered. A lot of times you'll see the network logo down in the bottom right corner. But I think this design just lends itself to keeping this centered with the rest of the text. So I'm going to do that down there, and then maybe add some text like this, just like we have at the top, new series, and I'll say something like, here we go, only on HIP. And that way, viewers will know this is an exclusive show that is premiering on the channel and that you can't see it anywhere else. So there we go, only on HIP. And maybe I'll make that even smaller, because I think that is the least priority of all the information on this page. Alright, next up is this show schedule. I think I just want to differentiate the numbers and the actual times from the actual show titles a little bit differently. So let's take a look at our different weights. Maybe I'd even go italic. That way it just has a different style. I could do probably semi-bold italic. When you're kind of pairing weights of fonts, a lot of times you can look at the different weights. So we've got regular, semi-bold, bold, extra bold. And if you jump 2 different weights, a lot of times that's just kind of a rule of thumb, a good way to pair 2 different weights of fonts together. So I'm going to go from extra bold, not down to bold, but down to semi-bold. But I also want to make it italic. And I think the weight difference there and changing it from italic or from regular to italic is going to differentiate it enough. And you can clearly see that's 2 different types of information. We've got the times and the show titles. So there we go. I'm going to make sure that's nice and centered and take a look at this as a whole from a little bit further back. Maybe give a little bit more spacing to this line. Actually, why don't I grab this line and move it right to the halfway point? And that way I can space everything out nice and evenly on that halfway point. So I can bring this information down a little bit, maybe make that just a tad smaller. There we go. And then maybe bring this down just a bit. And now that I'm looking at it, I think the logo at the bottom could move up just a tad. I'll just move this text down a little bit, and that new series text, it's so close to the word Silver Lake that it almost feels like it's supposed to be part of the title, so I think I'm going to bring that up. And that actually is just helping balance out the show logo down here at the bottom. It's just making it all very uniform, very consistent, and spaced out. So I'm going to just drag that down a little bit on the bottom, and now just looking at this as a whole, it feels very balanced, very unique logo up here. Actually, I'm noticing this little swash on the L is running into that A just a little bit the further I zoom out, so I'm just going to grab my touch type tool, drop that down just a little bit, give that a little more breathing room there, and I think that's going to do it. This looks like a perfectly decent mock-up for this promo package, and I think I can move on to my next design, which is Wineographer. So this is going to be very different looking style of typography compared to this one right here, which is very kind of clean and modern, and the energy drink, which is bold, grungy, in your face. Instead, we're moving into a wine company, a vineyard. So really quickly, let me just do an image search to show you what kind of stuff we can expect from a wine label. I'm just going to search for wine bottle label and then go to my images. So like this one right here, we've got, a very elegant serif font. We've got some italic serifs in here, all these little cool symbols, a frame to go around everything. And I think that that's clearly something that the designer was pulling inspiration from when they set up this document for me. I mean, if we could find a bottle of wine like this one right here that has a crazy hand-cut font on it, I mean, clearly That's from 2004. It looks like that might even be like an 8-bit font right there. Like, clearly, this is not on the same level as something like this, at least from the perspective of a wine connoisseur. I don't personally know, but I think that you literally can judge a wine bottle by its label. You can know that something that's designed more like this is going to be a little bit more premium than something that's designed, I don't know, like this. So obviously those aren't real wine companies, but it is something I need to be aware of as I choose my typefaces. So let's start laying out some text here. First of all, I think I have a lot more text on this one than others. Under the display copy, we've got our process produces exceptional wine superior in character and style, and then they dropped down a line and gave me we produce our wines by hand, blah, 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 blah. So a big block of text. So I'm going to need to handle this a little bit differently than I was the just, couple of words that I had to lay out on the Gravity Blaster and even the show schedule that was on the HIP network. This is something that needs to be all contained into one block of text that you want to read together as a unit. And on top of all that, I have the bottle label that I need to design, which I think I'll do that in a second. So let's just start with this display copy. So first, our process produces exceptional wine, and I'll bring that in, paste it in, and it needs to be something that I can see. I'll grab this color, the ornament color, and make sure I'm on that green color. So it's like this pale green. I want to grab the hex code for that. Okay, and then I'll change my font to be that same color. Whoop, whoop, whoop. Here we go. Okay, and I do not want to use Balboa. That was the font we were using for Gravity Blaster. What do we want to do? Well, I'm thinking we're going to want a serifed font. So let's start there. Serifed, and I don't have quite as many serif fonts as sans serif, so clearly I'm using a lot more sans serif than serifed. But let's just take a look at some of the examples. This one right here is kind of elegant. This is kind of hard to see. Let me zoom in here. I'm definitely going to want to break this up into multiple lines of text. And what I'm thinking here, by the way, my thought process is that because they separated these out into two different lines, and my designer gave me a frame and this ornament that's basically acting as a divider, it seems like the designers already kind of thought through how the type could be laid out, potentially, putting this single line up at the top and then this bigger block of text in here. So let me copy that. I'll put that in here. Obviously that's a huge line of text. Let me grab these and bring them into the typography folder. And I'll worry about this in a minute. I'm just going to turn it off for now. And take a look at this font again. So I'm going to zoom in here nice and close so we can see what it looks like and just zoom through some of these. And that one is pretty bold, and even on the regular version, it's kind of more playful. It feels more playful to me. I want this to be a very elegant, professional looking typeface. So this one is a little bit better. That italic text is actually really nice. You can see how different typefaces look, serif typefaces look between regular and italic. That's something that you see a lot, and a lot of times it can make the text look pretty elegant compared to other styles of text. All right, let me keep on going down the list. Bookman, that's similar to Bookmania. That's the one we used over on the HIP network for the Silver Lake logo. Got a font called Eloquent. But that's really big and bold. And I mean, just looking at the samples right here, you can kind of get an idea. I think Kepler, that's a little bit closer to what I'm after here. I'm going to keep going down the list. Nope, nope, nope. Now this one, this is actually interesting. So this has a small caps version of the font. Actually, this one is all caps, I believe. It's called Roman all petite caps. So that's interesting. Sometimes typefaces have interesting ways of naming different weights. So we've got all petite caps, we've got all small caps. So that's going to be different somehow. Do I have all caps turned on? I don't. Okay, so even if I did an uppercase O or lowercase o, it's still going to look the same. So that's actually not what I imagine as small caps. I thought small caps meant that the uppercase letters are still going to be taller, but this particular font doesn't do it that way. Lining. So there's like the standard version of this font, I guess. Petite caps. and small caps. Okay, so I don't know. This particular typeface just has a very interesting way of naming their font sizes. So all petite caps and all small caps really just means one size. Even though it says small caps or petite caps, I don't know. It's just a different way of doing it. And then under Roman petite caps, you've got the actual upper and lowercase within the all caps font, and small caps is even different. So it looks like this smaller version is a little bit more compressed on the X height, the size of the actual letters, which is pretty interesting. It's actually really elegant. So maybe I'll try that. Let's try Roman petite caps or potentially all petite caps. It's just, the only difference is literally this O. I think I'm going to keep it all petite caps, and we'll see what that does. And then I need to break this up into a couple of lines because it's just too wide right now. So let me reposition this so I can see it as a whole, at least this half of the frame. And I think I'm just going to go in here and start dropping down some lines. So I'll break that line right there. And then, so our process produces exceptional wine, superior in, and then maybe character and style. Or maybe in should go on that last line. Yeah, I think that fits a little bit better. They're matching their widths a little bit nicer. It is center justified, which I wanted. I don't want to put this, on the left justification. That just doesn't feel like it fits with the center alignment of the other elements. So I think that'll work. It might just be a little small. So maybe I'll bump this up from 24 to 30. And yeah, I think that's a better size. I'll just bump it up a little bit, or maybe I'll bring the ornament down. But that's kind of like the divider between this first statement and then the block of text. Let's see if we have any guides on this document. We don't. So I'm again going to just bring out some guides, this time by hand. Let's see, if my document is 960 wide, I need half of 960, which would be 480. So roughly 480. There, I did it. Okay, so that's the halfway point of this side of the frame. And I want to make sure this is lined up to it as well. So let me just get it out of the way and snap it. Why am I having so much trouble here? I think it's trying to snap to everything but the guide. So let me make sure that snapping is set to guides. It is. Then I'll just turn off everything else for now. And there we go. That feels like it snapped correctly. And I've got some more text here now. Okay, so this text I need to get contained within this frame. Now, right now, this text is all on one long line, and dropping it down one line at a time, like I did for this, would not be very intuitive. It'd be pretty hard. If I change the sizing or the spacing, I'd have to redo all of the dropping of the lines again and again and again. Instead, there's a much simpler way, and that's using a text box. So first of all, I need to copy this text. So I'm going to select all, Command A, copy, Command C, escape out of there. And then I want to draw a text box with my text tool. So I press T to get to my text tool, and then click and drag. That'll give me this marching ant selection. But that's going to make a text box if I let go. And then I can paste that text in, and that text is going to stay contained within that text box. Now I can adjust that text box. If I go into edit the text, I can reshape this however I want. I can compress it down, and the text is always going to fit in there. If I hold Option, it'll scale from both sides. So that way it's all fit in there perfectly. So I'll delete this long line of text now, turn off my guide, and I need to make this the same typeface as what I have up here. So that was called Mrs. Eves. So let's change that. Mrs. Eves. There's also an OT version. I don't know, that looks a little bit different. But let's just see if we keep it in the same font family. Maybe I'll just go to the standard version for this text. I think that looks pretty elegant, very professional. Yeah, I actually like that a lot. Now, there are some other options that we have with our typography to give us a little bit more control. For instance, Photoshop is automatically right now hyphenating some of my longer words that aren't fitting very well, but I can disable that feature. With that text layer selected, I'm going to go to my paragraph tab and uncheck hyphenate, and then it will not hyphenate anything. I think that's what I want for this particular block of text. Now I could, expand this out a little bit so that it feels a little bit more like a block of text, and then I could change the size of this frame just like the designer said to, size to text here, grab those points and then bring this up, and then, just position this however I need to. But I don't like quite how wide that is, so I think I'm going to bring it in just a little bit, maybe like that, and then just bring this up a touch. Now I have some other paragraph options. I could align this to the left justification, but again, that doesn't really fit with my center justified design on this half of the frame. But I have other options over here. This is also available in Illustrator, by the way, called justify last left. What this is going to do is justify both the left and right edges of all of the text, and then left justify the last line. Or I could change that to center justify the last line, or right justify the last line, or completely justify everything. Now obviously that does not look good at all for that last word, but it's something to be aware of. So maybe I want to fully justify this on the left and right and leave that last word left justified. That looks pretty nice. I think I'm just going to scale it in a little bit, and actually, I just made a mistake. I tried to transform the text with Command T, but as you can see, that's literally squashing it in there. I don't want that, so I'm going to hit Escape. Instead, I need to click in with my text tool, and then grab these transform handles and bring it in. Now, one issue that I am seeing here, and that happens when you're doing full justification like this, is that you get these giant gaps sometimes. And that's exaggerated when you uncheck hyphenation. If you check that back on, then it's going to fit everything much better. So maybe I should turn hyphenate back on and just be okay with that one hyphenation of fermenters. Or, from here I could try bringing it in a little bit, and there we go. Actually, that got rid of all of the hyphenations. So it's really just playing around with the way that everything is being laid out until you're happy with the way it looks. Maybe you don't like the full justification, you want to keep it to the center justification. It's totally up to you in what you think is working best for that particular design. I think I'm going to keep this as center justified and make sure there's no hyphenation, and that way it's going to look the way that I want it to. The kerning and the tracking is all pretty uniform throughout every line. And I'm just not going to worry about the full justification on the side. Since I have that frame around the text, I think that's just going to block it off nicely. I don't need to worry about it. Now, one thing about all of this text is that it is a little bit hard to read on top of that background. So I think what I want to do is add a drop shadow to this entire group. So I'm just going to go down to drop shadow, reset it to my default settings, and then just turn that off and back on. So it looks like it's a little bit further down than I want it. I don't need it to really be off the text at all. Just like that, gives it a little bit of a shadow that makes all of that a little easier to read. All right, now that that's done, I'm going to just drop down this entire group a little bit, not quite centered, a little bit above center, like that, I think. And I think I'd say I'm pretty happy with that layout. I'm going to drop that ornament down a little bit. Now we've got our first block of text right here, the ornament divider, and then the frame around our block of text using the actual text box. Next up is this label, which is also going to have quite a bit of text on it. So I'm going to double click into this smart object and into the next smart object, which is the label, and one more time into this smart object. So this is the actual label. It was created in Illustrator, it looks like. So I'm going to be making my text in here and then just saving it in the smart object, and it will show up in Photoshop. So I won't be able to edit it in Photoshop, but because it's just part of a mock-up on that wine bottle label right here, I think that's fine. You wouldn't want to have to, try and fake all of that little text fitting onto that label. So keeping it in a smart object is actually probably a better way to go. And I actually want to point something out here really quick, and that's that you should be making considerations on where you set your type, whether it's in Photoshop or Illustrator, because the tools are both very robust. The type tools that each program has are very robust, but they are not equal. There is things like the glyph palette that you can choose any single glyph from the selected font in both Photoshop and Illustrator. That's great. But the touch type tool that you have inside of Illustrator, that is not a thing inside of Photoshop. And the reason for that is because Photoshop is not primarily a typesetting program. Neither is Illustrator. In all honesty, InDesign is the typesetting program. That's what you want to go to when you're making multi-page documents like magazines and even books. But Photoshop is primarily a photo-based manipulation program, and for things like layout like this and mock-ups. Typesetting is much more suited for Illustrator, at least when it comes to design, And it has those tools that make things like turning text into a logo much simpler to do. That being said, transferring text from Illustrator to Photoshop can be done, but it is not that easy. Really quickly, I'm just going to show you. I could say File, Export As, and save this Illustrator file as a Photoshop PSD. I'll just stick it on my desktop. And then I could, under here, make sure that my resolution is set to 72, make sure that Preserve Text Editability is turned on and click OK. That'll take a second to export the PSD. I can come into Photoshop, open it up, look at my desktop, and there we go. I've got my board. And sure enough, all of my text is there. It is editable. I can do whatever I want with it. But things like this line, they're not vector. That was a vector path in Illustrator, and even though Photoshop supports vector paths, it's rasterized. I can't edit that the same way. So the text, transferring that over works great, and for that one purpose, I think that's a perfectly acceptable way of transferring type that you set in Illustrator to Photoshop. Otherwise, you would have to do something like select the text layer, copy it, and then paste, but then you can't just paste because it's going to paste it as a smart object or pixels, something like that. So you'd have to type out the text, and then it does transfer all the formatting that you had. But then you noticed it didn't paste it right where I had it in Illustrator, so I'd have to line it up. So it's kind of a futzy little process, but something you should be aware of. If you need to set your type inside of Illustrator, which a lot of times you do, then you can export it as a PSD and preserve that text editability. You just kind of have to do it in a roundabout way. You'll probably have to end up transferring those text layers into the document like this. So if I were to have laid this text out in Illustrator, I would have just exported it as a PSD and then duplicated those layers into this document. Because I don't really need any of those advanced text tools in Photoshop for this particular example, I'm totally fine with just laying out this text. Putting up a couple of lines here and making a text box there, totally doable inside of Photoshop. Okay, now let's get back to the actual wine bottle label. I'll lay out some of this text. So I've got a whole bunch of information on this document that I need to bring over. I'll just copy it all at once. And I think I'm going to make it the same color as the label here and that border we've got up there, the decorative border. And I've got to figure out how I want to space all this out. Well, again, because this was all broken up into lines, I think that's probably how the client wants the information separated. So I'm going to start by just breaking up everything into its own line. Make sure that I get all that text. I'll break all these up in their own text layers. I'm just cutting everything but the top line, duplicating, and then pasting it in. Alright, so there are all of my lines. I'm assuming that this information, the website, the percentage of alcohol, and the size of the wine bottle, that's probably going to go down at the bottom. Generally, on drinks, you see that down at the bottom of the label. We've got 2006 vintage, Pinot Noir, trap code, emissions. I'm reading this in reverse order, so it's a little confusing, but it looks like we're going to say who made this wine, so that's Wineographer Wine Company, established 2000, and then the original. Now that actually, yep, that should have been on a second line. I don't know why it wasn't, but let me grab that, cut, duplicate, and paste. So Wineographer Wine Company, established 2000. First thing I want to do is go to my layers, and I'm actually going to make a new layer. Get my color palette out of the way. And I want to grab all the text and cut it and put it on that second layer. That way I can lock the label, and that way I can work in here, drag, click and drag, without grabbing that background. I want to convert all of these to center justified so that I can just align them to the center, and no matter what I do now, whether I change the font, the size, anything, it's going to stay aligned to the center. And then I think I want to use the same font family, Mrs. Eves, that we did on this text because it's very elegant. It has some versatility with the different styles. So why don't I just change all of them at once to start to Mrs. Eves. Make sure I'm under all classes. And we'll just start with the lining. That's kind of like the standard version. And then figure out our hierarchy of information. So we've got the manufacturer and the year. Well, that's not even the year of the wine. That's the year they were founded. We've got the text, the original. And then we have the name of the wine, which is Trapcote Emissions, and it's a Pinot Noir, 2006 vintage, and then this information at the bottom. So what's the most important thing on the wine bottle? Probably the name of the wine and Pinot Noir, because people want to be able to see from the wine bottle, what it's called and what type of wine it is. So I think those two text layers are probably going to be bigger than everything else. I think this could probably it just happily fit to be about the same size as the actual logo that on the label there. But maybe we'll do that that all caps version and see what that looks like. So let me get this out of the way. And actually, I'll use this character palette. Here we go. So instead of Roman lining, let's use like the petite caps. Yeah, that looks nice. I think that fits. And because I'm using it in the rest of the document, I think I'm going to keep that. And why don't we do that for this one down here too? So I'm just going to sample that with the eyedropper. Maybe make it a little bit bigger. That is important information. So I'll probably just have that take up about the entire width of the base there. So maybe 24 points. And then this one, I'll just round it down to, say, 18. There we go. Yeah, that feels pretty good. And then I think Trapcote Emissions is obviously going to need to be bigger. Now, I like the whole small caps version of this font. So I think, let's see, this one right here feels really nice. I think that is a great way to kind of single out the name of the wine. The original sounds like it's kind of, fancy, basically. So I think I want to choose a fancy font. So why don't we find a script font for this one? You see a lot of script fonts on wine bottles. So maybe the original is written out in this nice script font. So let's change that to script and then just take a look. So we've got a lot of different versions. Adorn, very elegant, fancy. Alfresco, that looks more like hand lettering, kind of girly. Now, obviously, I could be going to Typekit to find more fonts, but I'm just trying to pull from what I already have. I think these first two are my favorite, and between the two, probably the first one, honestly. I think that looks pretty decent. Just placed there, maybe a little bit bigger. The original, Trapcote Emissions Pinot Noir 2006 vintage. I think we should make Pinot Noir a little bit bigger. So let's see, Trapcote Emissions is set to about 44. Let's change that to like 48. And then we'll change this to 38. Or maybe even 34. Something like that. And then I'm really liking this all caps. So why don't we go to either petite small caps or, yeah, I think this all small caps actually works better. So that's all just like this nice blocked out piece of text. But honestly, this is all feeling pretty empty right now with just a whole bunch of text. So why don't we just grab that element, that ornament that we were using right here. I'll copy that path and paste it into my document here. And that's going to ask me, do I want to paste as a compound shape or a compound path? The compound shape is fine. It just doesn't have any styling to it, so I'm gonna fill that with the same color. And now I can use this as kind of like a divider. So it separates the name from the type of wine. And then let's change this up a little bit and maybe do an italic font. I don't think there's an italic version of this. But if I remember right, there was a Mrs. Eve's OT. So let's find that. Mrs. Eve, yeah, there we go. So it's like another extended version of the font. And there we go, we've got an italic. So maybe bold or just regular. We'll go with, I can't decide. Regular is a little bit too thin, so I think I'm going to go with bold italic. And that way I just have some variation there. Take a look at this from a little bit further back. Maybe space these elements out a little bit more. And I think I want to change my script font. So I'm going to grab that and maybe go back to the other version, or the other font that I was looking at. So this is what I had. I think this one is a little bit less decorative. There's less swirls around it, and the lines are a little bit thicker, which I think helps. There is a bold version of this too, but I think honestly the regular is going to be fine. I'm going to turn that down a little bit. Again, this is just all that hierarchy of information. Again, I'm trying to make what's most important stand out the most, and then just kind of make a layout that feels balanced from there. So I think something like that might look great. So I'm going to save this. Remember, this is a smart object. This is very important, the order. I save my vector smart object and I'll close it. Then I'll go into the label. There it's updated. And sure enough, the designers even made this foil texture overlay. So it's adding like this gold foil overlay over everything. So that's cool. That's a really cool setup. I'm going to save this label, which is a Photoshop Smart Object. And then the wine bottle mockup document needs to be saved. There we can see that label right there on the bottle. I will close this once it's updated. There we go. We're back into our main PSD. The label has been updated, and I think that's working out well. Now, if I'm being honest, I think this text right here could move down a little bit and just add a little bit more space between everything. So this is a bit of a process, but I'm going to go through it all again. I'm going to jump into my wine bottle mockup. I'm going to go into my label. I'm going to go into the vector smart object, and then I'm going to grab this text, bring it down a little, bring this down a little, space this out just a bit, even more. Okay, that feels better. Save the smart object. Save the smart object. Save the smart document. And this is a really big document, so it's taking a little bit of time. But there we go. It's all updated. And now if I undo, just step back once, you can see that little adjustment I made. So just spread all that text out. We went from no label to a full label. And now just looking at it as a whole, the only thing that's still bothering me is that this text is just a little too hard to read on top of that background. I think I need to go back into my drop shadow and then just make it darker. And I might need to increase my spread a little bit. That's just going to really thicken up that shadow. I don't want to overdo that. I just want to make it pop a little bit more, play with the size and the opacity, just so that is a little bit easier to read. Be a little bit darker, a little bit larger. But that way we can see without and with, and that just makes that pop a little bit better. If I zoom to 100%, we can see how that looks a little bit more clearly, off and on, and the difference between what we had here and how it is now. So it is subtle, but it makes it a little bit easier to read, and I think that's going to work for us. So I'm going to save that, get all these frames back in the hands of the designer so that he can finish them off, and I think that was a pretty successful typographic journey.